There is a kind of cruelty that wears the face of law. It does not shout. It does not bleed. It signs its name at the bottom of a paper, adjusts its badge, and rides away. And the world calls it order. In the summer of 1874, somewhere between the last town with a name and the first stretch of land God seemed to have forgotten, a woman was left in the dust by the one man who had promised before witnesses and a worn Bible to keep her. She had no horse, no water, no map. The nearest settlement was 2 days by foot across cracked earth that shimmered with heat like something alive and hungry. Her name was Clara. The man who left her was her husband, a United States Marshal, a man with a badge the size of a small sun and a heart, it turned out, considerably smaller. He did not leave her in a moment of passion. He did not leave her in rage or madness. He left her because he was told to, or so he claimed, because she had become, in the language of powerful men sitting in cool offices far from the plains, a liability, an inconvenience, a loose thread in a story they were still writing. He left her standing in the open like a fence post, and he rode north without looking back. What happened next is not a story about rescue. It is a story about what a woman decides to become when the world strips everything from her and leaves only the walking. It is a story about a stranger on a horse who almost didn't stop, about a marshal who almost got away with it, about a territory that almost swallowed a woman whole, and the woman who refused to be swallowed, almost is doing a lot of work in this story. Keep reading. Clara Hensley had never been the kind of woman who cried at weddings, not even her own. She stood in the small Baptist church on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, in a dress that had belonged to her mother, taken in at the waist by 3 inches because Clara was built narrower, and let out at the hem because she stood 2 inches taller than the woman who had worn it first. The alterations showed if you looked close enough. Clara never minded. She was not a woman who spent much time pretending that borrowed things were her own. The man beside her was Thomas Aldrich Holt. Marshal Thomas Aldrich Holt. He was 38 years old, square-jawed, dark-haired going silver at the temples, and possessed of the kind of stillness that some women mistake for depth. Clara was 24. She had mistaken it too, at first. By the wedding day, she was no longer entirely certain, but she had already said yes to enough people that saying no felt like pulling a thread that would unravel more than just the engagement. So she stood in her mother's altar dress, and she did not cry. She said the words. He said the words. The preacher closed his Bible with a sound like a hand slapping a table. And that was that. Clara Hensley became Clara Holt on a Thursday afternoon in June with 13 people watching, a ceiling fan turning overhead so slow it barely moved the heat, and a fly circling the candles like it had nowhere more important to be. The first year was not bad, exactly. Thomas was gone more than he was home, which suited both of them in ways neither spoke aloud. He worked the territory between Caldwell and the New Mexico line, tracking men the law wanted found, and dragged back to face the particular theater of justice that the territory had arranged for them. He was good at the work. Clara had heard this from other people, from the sheriff's wife, from men at the general store who lowered their voices slightly when they mentioned Thomas's name, the way people lower their voices around a sleeping dog of uncertain temperament. Clara kept the house. She kept the accounts. She grew a kitchen garden that put out tomatoes the size of her fist, and beans that climbed the fence post so enthusiastically she had to cut them back twice before August. She was not unhappy. She was also not happy in the way she had once imagined happiness worked. The warm, constant thing, like a fire that never needed feeding. What she had instead was occupation. Purpose. The small satisfactions of a well-run day. Thomas came home every 6 to 8 weeks. He was not cruel to her. He was not warm either. He was present in the way a piece of good furniture is present. Solid, functional, occupying space. They ate together. They slept in the same bed. On Sunday mornings he read the paper, and she read whatever book she had borrowed from the lending shelf at the dry goods store, and they sat across from each other in a silence that had never been comfortable enough to be called companionable, but had never been hostile enough to be called anything worse. It was in the second year that things shifted. Thomas began coming home later. Not by much at first. A day, 2 days passed when he'd said he'd return. Then a week. Then she stopped calculating. She stopped setting a place for him at dinner when he wasn't there because the empty plate had begun to feel less like hope and more like accusation, and she wasn't certain who it was accusing. He brought back less money. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, quietly, completely, without immediately saying so. She adjusted the household accounts. She made the garden work harder. She sold preserves to 3 families on the next road over and told herself this was industry, not desperation, because she was not yet ready to call it the second thing. When she finally asked him one October evening with the wind pushing against the windows and the lamp burning low because she'd been careful with the oil, he told her the work had changed. There were new arrangements, new men above him who had their own ideas about how the territory should run. He said this the way people say things they hope will function as an explanation without actually explaining anything. She looked at him across the table. "Thomas," she said, "what have you gotten into?" He looked at the table, then at the wall behind her left shoulder. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank what was left in it, even though it had been cold for an hour. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said. She worried about it extensively. By the following spring, she had pieced together enough to understand the shape of it, even if she didn't have all the specific details. Thomas was working for someone else now, or rather, he was working for the same official bodies he had always worked for, while also quietly working for another set of interests that existed in the profitable shadow space between law and the men who bent it. He was not the first Marshal to make this arrangement. He would not be the last. The territory was large, and oversight was thin, and the men with money had long since learned that a badge was as purchasable as anything else if you knew the right conversation to start. Clara did not know all of this the way you know a fact you have studied. She knew it the way you know a smell. You can't always name every component, but your body understands it before your mind does, and makes decisions accordingly. She began keeping her own money separate. Not much. A little from the preserves. A little from some mending work she took on without advertising it. She kept it in a tin behind the loose board under the kitchen window, the one Thomas had never gotten around to fixing. She told herself it was practical. She told herself lots of things that year. The letter arrived in April. It came addressed to Thomas, but it had been opened and resealed badly. The envelope flap sitting at a slightly wrong angle, the adhesive tacky in a way that was not entirely right. Someone had read it before it reached the house. Maybe Thomas himself, forgetting she might see. Maybe someone else entirely. She read it. She sat down. She read it again. The language was careful in the way that careful language always sounds when it is trying to cover up something that would not survive plain words. But the meaning was clear enough. Thomas had been given a task. He had been given a deadline. And attached to both the task and the deadline was Clara. Not by name, but by description, a description so precise she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the April morning. She was described as a potential complication. A person who had become aware of things she shouldn't be aware of. The letter did not say what should be done about her. It didn't need to. The people who write letters like that have long since learned that you do not write the ending. You only describe the problem and let the man with the badge work out the arithmetic. She put the letter back exactly as she found it. She went out to the garden. She pulled weeds for 2 hours. She came back inside and made dinner. Thomas came home 4 days later. He seemed normal. He was, if anything, slightly more attentive than usual. Asked about the garden, commented on the soup, looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but that registered somewhere in the back of her mind as the particular tenderness of a man who has made a decision he hasn't told you about yet. She slept lightly that week. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From attention. There's a difference. Fear makes you small and still. Attention makes you sharp. On the 5th day after his return, Thomas told her he needed to make a supply run south. A property down near the Cimarron line that needed inspection. He suggested she come along. The weather was good, he said. It would do her good to get out of the house. She had been looking pale. She had not been looking pale. She had been looking exactly like herself. She knew this because she had been watching herself carefully in the small mirror above the wash basin, cataloging her own face like a woman taking inventory. She said yes. She packed 2 days of food and filled the water canteen twice. Once with a visible pack, and once in a second small canteen, she tucked inside her skirt bundle with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent a year learning to be careful without looking like she was being careful. She put the tin of money in the bottom of her boot. It made her walk slightly oddly, but not enough for anyone to notice unless they were paying the particular kind of attention she hoped no one was paying. They left before dawn. The landscape south of Caldwell opened up in the way landscapes do when the last of civilization has given up pretending. The scrub brush thinned, the trees became suggestions, and the sky took over in a way that felt less like scenery and more like a statement. Clara watched it from the wagon seat. She had always found it beautiful in a way that also frightened her, which was how she felt about a number of things. Thomas was quiet. He drove the horses with the focused inattention of a man thinking about something else. Twice she caught him glancing at her sideways with that same unreadable look, and twice she rearranged her expression into something mild and said nothing. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek that was barely more than a seep in the cracked earth. Clara climbed down. She stretched. She walked a short distance from the wagon and looked at the country around her, the flat, the scrub, the particular silence of a place where the wind doesn't so much blow as occupy. She heard Thomas come up behind her. She turned. He was not holding a weapon. She registered this first, the absence of it. She had prepared herself for a weapon. What she had not prepared herself for was the expression on his face, which was something she had no good word for. Not rage. Not the cold flatness of a man doing a job. Something worse. Something that looked, in the hardest-to-face part of it, like sorrow. Like a man who had made a choice he considered unfortunate, but final. "Clara," he said. "Thomas," she said. The wind moved through the brush between them. He told her she had to stay here. He used the word stay as if it were a reasonable thing, as if he were suggesting she take a rest while he ran an errand. He said there were people, he did not name the people, which she noted, who needed certain matters resolved before the season turned. He said he was sorry. He actually said this. She believed him, in the way she would have believed a man sorry to step on a beetle, genuinely regretful about the specific sensation, entirely committed to the stepping. She said nothing. He turned back to the wagon. He took her larger pack off, her clothes, the food she had packed visibly, and sat on the ground beside her. He left the horses water. He did not leave the canteen. He climbed back onto the wagon seat. She watched him. She stood exactly where she was standing, and she watched him pick up the reins, and she watched the horses respond, and she watched the wagon begin to move north the way they had come, and she kept watching until the sound of the wheels had fully dissolved into the empty air, and there was nothing left to watch except the plains. Then she sat down in the dust, not from weakness, from the simple need to let the size of what had just happened pass through her body at its own speed without her having to remain upright through it. She had known, or suspected, or prepared for this. She had taken the precautions she was able to take. She had the money in her boot. She had the second canteen inside the bundle. She had done, in the available time, and with the available information, what she could do. And still, the sitting was necessary. She sat for perhaps 10 minutes. She looked at the sky, which was the brilliant, indifferent blue of a sky that has no opinion about what happens beneath it. She thought about her mother's dress, which was hanging in the wardrobe at the house in Caldwell. She thought about the garden, and whether anyone would water it. She thought about the tin of money she had been keeping, the portion of it she had not been able to fit in her boot, which was still behind the loose board under the kitchen window. She thought about Thomas's face, the sorrow on it. She decided she would not spend any more time thinking about Thomas's face. She stood up. She opened the bundle and took out the second canteen. She shook it full. She calculated water, which she knew how to do because she had grown up in this country, and the people who grow up in this country learn early that water is not a given. Water is a negotiation, and you need to know the terms before you run short. One full canteen in this heat, moving on foot, was approximately 1 day. She needed 2. She knew there was a river. Not the seep they had stopped at, a proper river, the Cimarron, which ran roughly 12 miles south by her best reckoning from the direction Thomas had been driving. She could be wrong. She might be off by several miles in any direction. But she had been paying attention on the drive down, the way she had learned to pay attention to everything, and she was fairly certain about south. She picked up the pack. She put the canteen over her shoulder. She looked north one more time, in the direction Thomas had gone. She turned south, and she began to walk. The first 2 hours were the hardest, not because of the distance, but because her mind was still conducting the argument she had not been allowed to have. The things she might have said, the things he had said, the letter and the bad resealing and the expression on his face and the years of small adjustments and quiet economies and preserved tomatoes. Her mind wanted to pace the length of all of it like a woman in a waiting room. She let pace. She kept walking. She had learned early that you cannot stop the mind's argument. You can only make sure your feet don't stop while the argument is running. By the third hour, the heat had become the primary conversation. It was the particular heat of the southern plains in late spring, before the storms come in to complicate it, a heat that has a weight and a texture, and that pushes down from above and reflects up from the pale dust below, so that you are moving through it from all directions at once. Clara's dress darkened at the back. Her boots, good leather boots she had bought herself for money she had earned, began to press where the coin tin sat against the sole of her left foot. She readjusted her walking to compensate. She drank from the canteen in the small, measured sips of someone who understands that the quantity is finite and the need is not. She thought about water. She thought about the Cimarron, how it would look from a distance, a thin line of green in all that tan, and ochre, the cottonwoods that grew along riverbanks like they were leaning in to listen to the water. She had seen it once, as a girl, from a wagon seat, much like the one she had been sitting on this morning. It had seemed impossibly green. It had seemed like something from a different world or a different story. The same story, she decided now, just a different part of it. The sun moved across the sky the way it moves when you are watching it from necessity rather than admiration, measurably, deliberately, taking its time in a way that suggests it has other concerns, and you're not among them. She walked. The scrub brush made small, sharp shadows. A hawk circled somewhere above, and to her right, which she noted without either alarm or comfort, the hawk was doing its own arithmetic, and she was not in the relevant category. A lizard sat on a flat rock, and watched her pass with eyes like polished seeds. She watched it back for a moment, and then moved on. She thought, at intervals, about the letter. She turned over its language in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's under it, carefully, fully prepared for what might be there. She thought about the men who had written it, men she had never met, men who had looked at her life and her person and calculated her value in terms of what she knew and what she might say to whom, and had arrived at a number that came out to less than nothing. Men who had communicated this arithmetic to Thomas and left the rest to him. She thought about Thomas. She had promised herself she wouldn't, and she did it anyway, because you cannot always keep the promises you make in the dust to yourself. She thought about who he had been when she had said yes to him, when she had worn her mother's dress, when she had looked at his stillness and mistaken it for something solid. She thought about whether any of the good years had been true. She decided the question didn't have a useful answer, and filed it in the category of things she would think about when she was not in immediate need of her own full attention. She thought about what she would do if she got to water. Not if. When. She corrected herself. When. The Cimarron, if her reckoning was right, would put her within range of settlement. She had heard mention of a small ranch operation somewhere along the south bend of the river, a couple, and a grown son who ran cattle in the dry country the way people who have made peace with difficulty do, without fanfare, without complaint, with the particular quiet competence of people who have simply decided to be where they are. She did not know these people. She did not need to know them. She needed their water and their distance to be in a direction that led to something rather than standing in the geometric center of nothing. She had, by her rough calculation, about 6 miles of canteen water left. She picked up her pace. The land around her was not empty in the way that a room is empty. It was full of heat and hawk and lizard and the dry smell of sage that the boot disturbs with every step, full of wind that came from the west and occasional warm pushes, full of the vast patient indifference of a landscape that has been here far longer than anyone walking across it, and will be here far longer after. Clara found, as she walked into the afternoon, that this was not the terrible thing she might have expected it to be. There was something clarifying about indifference on this scale. The land did not dislike her. It did not wish her ill. It simply did not participate. Thomas had participated. Thomas had looked at her and made a choice. The land just sat there. She decided she preferred the land. The sun was 3 hours from the western horizon when she first caught the smell of water. Not the water itself, which was not yet visible, but the particular green, wet smell that open water sends ahead of itself across dry country like a calling card. She stopped walking. She lifted her face. She turned slightly and found it stronger and adjusted her direction by perhaps 12 degrees. She walked toward it. The cottonwoods appeared first, exactly as she had imagined them. A thin, soft green line cresting the low rise ahead, leaning slightly in the way of trees near water. She did not run. Running was what the water wanted her to do. To spend the energy she had been carefully not spending, to arrive breathless and unsteady. She walked. She walked with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who has been walking all day and, intends to keep walking for as long as walking is required. She crested her eyes. The Cimarron was below her, not wide, not dramatic, the particular unheroic brown of a plains river in dry season, moving low between its muddy banks with the unself-conscious practicality of water that has somewhere to go and is getting there. The cottonwoods lined both banks. The grass along the water's edge was green in a way that hurt slightly after all the pale dust. She went down to it. She knelt at the bank. She put her hands in the water and brought it to her face and held the cold and the wet against her skin. She drank, carefully, not too much at once, the discipline of someone who knows that too much cold water on an empty stomach and heat is its own problem. She filled the canteen. She sat back on her heels and looked at the river moving past her, indifferent and essential, carrying whatever it carried from wherever it started to wherever it ended, knowing nothing about Thomas Holt and caring less. She heard the horse before she saw it, hooves in the soft ground of the riverbank, coming from the west, moving at a canter that slowed to a trot and then to a walk as the rider pulled up 30 yards downstream and looked in her direction with the particular stillness of someone who has noticed something unexpected and is deciding what it means. Clara looked back. She did not stand up yet. She stayed on her heels at the water's edge and looked at the rider, and the rider looked at her, and the Cimarron moved between them as if it had its own opinion about what happened next. She was going to need to make a decision about what she said. She was going to need to make it carefully. She was very good at careful. The rider's name was Eli Cross, though Clara would not learn this for another 20 minutes. He sat his horse with the easy economy of someone who has spent more hours in the saddle than out of it, not performing comfort, just inhabiting it, the way a person inhabits a room they have lived in for years without once thinking about where the furniture is. His horse was a red roan with one white sock, and the look of an animal that had covered serious distance without complaint. The man on its back was somewhere between 30 and 40, weathered in the particular way that men who work outside in this country get weathered, which is to say the sun and wind had done their editing, and what remained was the essential version of the face rather than any decorative interpretation of it. He looked at Clara kneeling at the river's edge for a long moment. Then he swung down from the horse in a single unhurried motion, let the reins drop. The horse was trained to stand clearly because it did, and walked toward her at the pace of a man who is not running because there is no emergency, but is also not dawdling because he has eyes. He stopped 6 feet away. "Ma'am," he said. "Sir," she said. The Cimarron moved past them both. "You alone out here?" he asked. Not demanding, not suspicious exactly. The tone of a man taking stock of a situation that didn't entirely add up. "I am now," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the pack beside her on the bank. He looked at the canteen she was holding, her hands still wet from the river, her dress dark with sweat at the collar, and him, her boots dusty with the particular pale dust of the plains that meant a person had walked a significant distance through open country rather than coming by horse or wagon. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic. "How far you walked?" he asked. "About 12 miles by my count." He said nothing for a moment. He was not a man, she would come to understand, who felt the need to fill space with sound simply to avoid silence. "From which direction?" he asked. "North," she said. He looked north. There was nothing to see in that direction except the continuation of what was already in all directions, scrub sky, the long, slow argument between flat ground and flat cloud. No wagon, no road exactly, no indication of how a woman in a good dress came to be kneeling alone at the Cimarron 12 miles from any point of origin he could identify. "There's settlement north of here you came from?" he asked. "Not within 12 miles, she said. Another silence. He was patient with silences. She appreciated this more than she would have been able to articulate right then, because she was holding several things inside her chest that were waiting for the moment when she could afford to put them down, and she needed the silence to help her keep holding them a little longer. "You need help," he said. It was not a question, and it was not an assumption. It was a man stating a thing that was simply, visibly true, and seeing if she would argue with it. She looked up at him. "I need to get to the nearest settlement," she said. "I have money. I can pay for transportation and for information about where I might send a letter." "Letter to who?" "A lawyer," she said. "In Caldwell." He looked at her for a moment longer. Something moved across his face, not pity, which she would not have tolerated, and not the particular kind of masculine concern that is really another word for condescension. Something more like recognition. The expression of a person who has seen a corner of a situation and identified its species without needing the full picture drawn for them. Settle Ranch is 4 miles east, he said. Couple name of Fitch. Good people. They'll put you up. I told you I have money. I know you did, he said. I heard you. Come on. He walked back to his horse. He gathered the reins. He looked back at her once, not to check if she was following, she thought, but simply because he was a man who checked the things behind him the way you check a door when you leave a room, not from anxiety but from habit. She picked up her pack. She followed him. He offered his hand to help her mount. She took it without commentary, settled herself sideways on the back of the saddle behind him because there was no other arrangement available, and held the back of the saddle rather than him because she was not yet in a position of sufficient trust to hold a man she'd known for 6 minutes. The horse moved east. She watched the Cimarron diminish behind them until it became that thin green line again, the suggestion of water in all the dry, and then she turned her face forward and thought about the letter she would write. The Fitch Ranch came into view as the sun was leveling its last serious light across the country. Low buildings, a windmill that turned with a cheerful squeak she could hear from a quarter-mile out, a split-rail corral with 3 horses in it who watched the newcomers with the mild animal interest of creatures whose day had already been decided. A dog came out from under the porch and barked twice and then apparently concluded she was acceptable and went back under the porch. The woman who came to the door was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had decided some years ago to stop performing anything and simply be itself. She looked at Clara the way the dog had looked, a quick assessment, a conclusion, and opened the door wider without being asked. "Come in," she said. "You look like you've been having a day." "I have," said Clara. This was how she came to be sitting at Addie Fitch's table 40 minutes later, drinking coffee that tasted like the second-best thing that had ever happened to her, and eating cornbread with her hands because the fork felt like an unnecessary step, and Addie had not offered one, having apparently correctly read the situation. Eli Cross sat across from her. He had not left. He had not explained why he hadn't left. He drank his own coffee and watched her eat with the expression of a man who is waiting to understand something more fully before he decides what he thinks about it. She told them the useful parts of the story. Not all of it. She was not yet certain which parts were safe to say aloud, which parts were evidence of something, which parts should be preserved for the lawyer, and not distributed casually to strangers over cornbread, however kindly meant. She told them she had been left. She told them where. She told them the direction she had walked. She did not tell them Thomas's name, or his badge, or the letter. Addie Fitch listened with the particular listening of a woman who has been in this country long enough to have heard many kinds of stories and learned to know which parts are the ones people need to tell and which parts are the ones people are not ready for yet. "You can sleep in the back room," Addie said when Clara had finished the cornbread. "There's a letter box at the trading post in Mino, which is 7 miles east. Eli can take you in the morning if he's of a mind." She looked at Eli. "I'm of a mind," he said. She looked at Clara. "That settle it?" she asked. "That settles it," said Clara. She slept that night in a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar and soap and slept deeply and without dreaming, the way the body sleeps when it has been running its emergency systems for an extended period and has finally identified a moment safe enough to shut them down. She woke before dawn, which she always did. She lay in the dark and listened to the windmill squeak and thought about the letter she was going to write. The lawyer's name was Harold Voss. She had used him twice before, once when she and Thomas had needed paperwork for the house, and once when her mother's small estate had needed settling. And both times he had struck her as a man who dealt in fact the way a carpenter deals in level surfaces, without preference or decoration. This was what she needed, someone who would look at what she told him and respond to the facts of it rather than the feelings. The facts were these. She had been taken to a remote location by her husband, a United States Marshal, under the pretense of a property inspection. She had been left in open country with insufficient water and supplies. Prior to this, she had read correspondence indicating that her husband had been operating in coordination with parties outside the law and that she had been identified as a risk to those operations. She was the legal wife of the man who had left her. She had rights under the law, more than the men who wrote that letter appear to have accounted for. There were things she knew. There were things she could demonstrate. And she was still, despite the best efforts of the previous day, alive. She would write all of this to Harold Voss. She would not mention the second canteen she had hidden in her skirt bundle. She would not mention the tin of money in her boot. Those were hers, and they were not fact for the letter. Eli Cross was waiting at the corral at first light, which she had expected. He had saddled both his horse and a small gray mare she had not seen the night before, which she had not expected. "Addie's horse," he said, seeing her look. "She don't ride much anymore. She said you could." Clara looked at the gray mare. The mare looked back at her with the calm, dark eyes of a horse that has seen enough to be past surprises. "Tell her thank you," said Clara. "Tell her yourself when we get back," said Eli. They rode east in the early cool of morning, the kind of morning that the plains produce sometimes, as if in apology for what the afternoons do to people. The air thin and clean, the sky going pink behind them where the sun was beginning its daily argument with the horizon, the brush silver with dew that would be gone inside an hour. Clara rode beside rather than behind Eli Cross because they each had their own horse, and she was not a woman who rode behind when she had the option of riding beside. For a while they rode without talking. This suited her. Then Eli said, without looking at her, "The man who left you, he a lawman?" She looked at him. "What makes you ask that?" she said. "The way you talked about the letter," he said. "Lawyer in Caldwell, quick as you could think of it. The way you didn't name the man. The way you talked about rights like someone who'd already worked out you had some, and was planning to use them." He paused. "Most women left out on the flats are thinking about survival first. You were thinking about documentation." She rode for a moment. "He's a marshal," she said. Eli nodded slowly. The nod of a man who had suspected something and was now arranging what he knew around the thing he'd just been told. "Corrupt?" he asked. "Increasingly," she said. He nodded again. "There are men in this territory," he said carefully, "who would be very interested in a marshal with that kind of history." She looked at him. "What kind of men?" she said. He met her eyes for the first time in the conversation, which she noted. He had not been avoiding her eyes, exactly. He had been giving her the particular courtesy of looking at the road so she could talk without being watched. Now, he looked at her directly, which was a different kind of thing. "Federal men," he said. "Out of Wichita. There's been an investigation running for about 8 months into certain arrangements in the Territory Marshal Service. Something involving land deals and the men behind them." He paused. "I'm not a federal man myself, but I've been in contact with the office." The morning moved around them. "What are you?" she asked. "Rancher," he said. "Mostly. My brother's the one with the federal connections. I ended up knowing what I know because I run cattle south of the Cimarron, and the Cimarron is apparently a useful corridor for moving certain things that shouldn't be moved." He said this with the flat tone of a man who is describing a geographic fact rather than his own personal irritation with the situation, though the irritation was there under it. "I've been watching the traffic on the river for 6 months." She thought about this. "How much did you already know?" she said. "Before you found me at the river?" He was quiet for a moment. "I knew a marshal called Holt had been seen at a ranch south of Caldwell 2 days ago," he said, "meeting with a man named Croft who was one of the primary persons of interest in the federal case. I knew Holt was said to have a wife." He paused. "I didn't know the rest until you told me." She looked at the road ahead. "You were already at the river," she said. "This morning. You were already there." "I ride that stretch most mornings," he said. "The river is where they move things. I watch for traffic. But you stopped for me." "Of course I stopped for you," he said, with the tone of a man who finds the alternative too obvious to discuss. She was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. She had come to the river in need of water, and the possibility of distance from where Thomas had left her, and she had found both of those things. She had also, it was becoming clear, walked into the edge of something much larger than the specific domestic brutality she had been navigating. The letter she had been composing in her head, careful, factual, addressed to Harold Voss, was still the right letter. But the audience for its information might be wider than a single lawyer in Caldwell. "The federal office in Wichita," she said. "Would they speak to me?" Eli Cross looked at her. "You have information relevant to the investigation?" he asked. "I have a letter," she said, "that I read. That was addressed to my husband. That I can describe in sufficient detail to be useful." She paused. "And I have 2 years of observations about the pattern of his behavior, the frequency of his contacts, the changes in the household income, and 3 specific instances where he made trips that did not correspond to any official case I could identify through the records he kept to the house." Another pause. "I kept notes." Eli Cross stopped his horse. She stopped hers beside him and looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression that had replaced the quiet, careful reading of the last hour with something that was not quite surprise. He did not look like a man who was easily surprised, but that was somewhere adjacent to it. A recalibration of his own. "You kept notes," he said. "I was not certain for what purpose," she said. "But I kept them. They're at the house, which is in Caldwell." which is where my husband has presumably returned. She looked at him steadily. I need to get to Caldwell before he does anything to the house. Like what? Said Eli. Like removing things that shouldn't be removed, she said. The notes are behind the loose board under the kitchen window. There's also a second set, copied, in the lining of a hat box in the wardrobe. Eli looked at her for another long moment. You copied them, he said. I was thorough, she said. The sun was up fully now, the dew already burning off the brush, the day beginning its climb toward the heat that would arrive by noon and stay until the mercy of evening. A meadowlark called from somewhere to the south with the cheerful indifference of a bird that has no ongoing federal investigation to concern itself with. There's a telegraph at Mino, said Eli. I can send word to my brother's contact in Wichita before we send your letter. He paused. With your permission. You have it, said Clara. They rode on. The trading post at Mino was a low building with a wide porch and the general look of a structure that had accumulated its current shape gradually rather than being planned, each addition answering a need as the need arose until the whole thing was entirely functional and entirely without intention. A man sat on the porch in a chair tipped back against the wall and watched them ride up with the gaze of a man who has watched people ride up for decades and has long since stopped being interested by it. Clara got down from Addie's mare. She tied the horse at the post. She went inside. The man behind the counter had the telegraph equipment and a shelf of writing paper and an inkwell that had been refilled recently. She could smell the fresh ink. She bought 2 sheets of paper and borrowed the inkwell and the pen that sat beside it and sat at the small table near the window and wrote her letter to Harold Voss. She wrote it cleanly. She wrote it the way she had composed it in the dark before dawn. Factual, sequenced, without emotion that was not relevant to the legal matter. She described the letter she had read. She described the behavior pattern. She described being taken south and left. She described her current location and her intention to return to Caldwell to retrieve her property. She told Harold Voss that there were federal investigators who might contact him in connection with these events and that she had given her consent to that contact. She signed it with her full name, Clara Hensley Holt. Both names, the one she had been born with and the one she had taken on a Thursday in June and was not yet sure what to do with. She folded the letter. She sealed it. She addressed it. She paid the man behind the counter to hold it for the next rider going north. She went back outside. Eli Cross was at the telegraph desk inside, writing his message. She waited on the porch. She looked at the road east, which continued to wherever roads went when they left small trading posts in dry country. She looked at the road west, which went back the way she had come, back toward the Cimarron, back toward the Fitch Ranch, back toward the 12 miles of dust she had walked through yesterday with a tin of money in her boot, and the particular focused calm of a woman doing what was necessary. Back, eventually toward Caldwell. Eli came out. He stood beside her on the porch. Message sent, he said. Good, she said. You want to go back to the Fitch place tonight, he said. Or, do you want to start north toward Caldwell? She considered. Caldwell was a 2-day ride. The notes were there. The hatbox copy. The tin behind the board. Thomas was also there, or would be, and Thomas was a man who had made a decision about her, and carried it out, and was presumably operating on the assumption that the decision had been final and effective. She wanted him to go on operating on that assumption for as long as possible. Tonight at the Fitches, she said. Start north at dawn. All right, said Eli. The meadowlark called again from somewhere out in the brush. Or a different meadowlark. She couldn't tell, and it didn't particularly matter. She untied Addie's mare. She swung herself up without assistance this time. The horse moved under her with the patient steadiness of a horse that has carried many people's weight and has made peace with that being its purpose. She turned it west and clicked her tongue, and the mare moved. Behind her, she heard Eli Cross gathering his reins and following, unhurried, the way he did everything. The sun pressed down from above. The road went west. Clara Holt rode toward whatever came next with a straight back and the measured breathing of a woman who has already survived the worst of the day and is now simply dealing with the remainder of it. They left the Fitch Ranch before the sun had finished deciding whether to come up. Addie stood in the door in her nightgown with a shawl over her shoulders and 2 cloth-wrapped parcels of food, which she pressed into Clara's hands with the efficiency of a woman who does not see much point in extending goodbyes beyond what is functionally necessary. You're right when you get there, Addie said. I will, said Clara. Addie looked at her for a moment with those eyes that had decided years ago to simply see things as they were. You're going to be all right, she said. not as comfort, as observation. I know, said Clara. She meant it. They rode north as the sky went from black to the deep blue of very early morning, and then to the thin gray that has not yet dawned but has given up pretending it isn't on the way. The horses moved at a steady trot, which covered ground without punishing either animal or rider, and Clara found the rhythm of it useful, something to calibrate her body to while her mind worked through what was coming. Caldwell was 2 days north, possibly a day and a half if they pushed through the midday rather than resting through the worst heat, which she was inclined to do. Every hour Thomas was in that house with the notes behind the board, and the hat box and the wardrobe was an hour in which he might, for whatever reason, decide to go looking. He had no particular reason to suspect she had documentation. The letter she had read had been returned to its envelope. The notes were behind a board he had never fixed. The hat box was in the back of the wardrobe behind winter things, and looked indistinguishable from every other hat box in every other woman's wardrobe in the territory. But Thomas had been, in other departments, underestimated by people who had later regretted it. She was not going to make that assumption about her notes. She told Eli this as they rode. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to recognize in the short time of their acquaintance as one of his primary qualities. He did not interrupt to offer reassurance or to reframe what she was saying in terms of his own knowledge. He listened to the things she was actually saying, and then, when she was done, thought about it for a moment before responding. The hatbox copy, he said. You said it's in a lining. Sewn into the silk lining of the crown, she said. The box looks untouched. I did the sewing myself, and I used thread that matches the original. How long did that take? She considered. About 2 hours, she said. He looked at her sideways. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has been practical for so long that she no longer considers the practical things worth explaining. How long have you been preparing for this? He asked. Not accusatory. Something else. The tone of a man revising a timeline he had been carrying in his head. For something like this, she said. About a year. She thought about the tin behind the board, the second canteen, the notes and their copy, the boot money, the preserved tomatoes, which had no bearing on the current situation, but were part of the same general posture, a woman making things as secure as they could be made in the available conditions. The letter you read, said Eli. How detailed was it? Careful, she said. The way letters are careful when the person writing them knows that careful language can be defended and plain language cannot. But the meaning was clear. Could you reproduce it? The content of it. She thought about this. She had read it twice. She had a good memory, not a perfect one, not the kind of memory that transcribes word for word, but the kind that holds the structure of things, the architecture of an argument, the specific shape of a phrase when the phrase is doing more work than the surrounding sentences. She could give the substance of it. Well enough, she said. That's what the federal men will want, said Eli. Not the physical letter. That's gone, presumably. But your account of its contents, given under whatever formal process they use, is evidence. It becomes part of the case record. She nodded. What kind of case is it? She asked. What is it actually about? The land deals you mentioned. Were they a vehicle for? He rode for a moment. You know about the territory settlement programs? He said. She did. The federal government had been running programs for several years designed to move settlers into the territory, open land for development, generate revenue from the process. It was, in theory, a system of organized settlement. In practice, it was a system that had a number of points where money moved between private hands and government processes, and those points were where the predictable things happened. Croft, the man Thomas met at the ranch. He runs a land brokerage, said Eli. On paper, he connects settlers with available parcels. In reality, he's been acquiring parcels through fraudulent claims, clearing them in ways that don't always survive close inspection, and reselling at profits that require certain official arrangements to remain in place. He paused. The Marshal's office is one of those official arrangements. Men like Thomas handle the complications. Someone files an inquiry that gets too close to the records. Someone threatens to talk. Someone becomes, as they apparently called your wife, a liability. She was quiet with this for a moment. How many people, she said. How many people in the operation, or how many people who became complications? She looked at him. Both, she said. He told her what he knew. The operation involved at least 4 other marshals in the territory, several land office clerks, 2 county officials whose names she did not recognize, and the man called Croft at the center of it. The complications were harder to quantify. He knew of 2 men who had filed inquiries, and then, withdrawn them under circumstances that were not fully explained. He knew of a homesteader family who had been moved off a parcel they had legitimate claim to through a series of legal maneuvers that had the fingerprints of official assistants. He did not know of anyone who had been physically harmed, though he said this with the careful qualification of a man who distinguishes between what he knows and what might be true. Yet, he added, she thought about Thomas's face, the sorrow on it. He didn't want to do it, she said, not defending him, stating a fact she had been carrying since the moment at the creek, turning it over in her hands without knowing what to do with it. That's possible, said Eli. It doesn't change it, she said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. They rode north through the morning and into the heat of midday, which they did not stop for, and through the long afternoon that followed, which had the particular exhausted quality of late afternoon in dry country, the light going gold and flat, and the shadows of the brush stretching east as if trying to get somewhere before dark. They spoke when there was something to say and were quiet when there wasn't, which was a comfortable rhythm Clara had not realized she missed until it was present. Thomas had filled silence the way some men do. Not with words, exactly, but with the weight of his own expectation, the sense that silence with him was never entirely neutral, was always slightly charged with whatever he was not saying. Riding beside Eli Cross, silence was simply silence. They stopped for the night at a place where a dry creek offered a windbreak and a flat piece of ground without too many rocks, and tethered the horses where they could reach what grass there was. Eli built a small fire from the dead wood in the creek. Not for warmth, exactly, though the nights cooled fast, but for the light and the purpose of it. Clara ate from Addie's food parcels, and Eli ate from his own provisions, and they sat on opposite sides of the small fire and watched it burn. Your brother, she said, the one with the federal connections. Will he move quickly? Depends on what the telegraph message does, said Eli. If the contact in Wichita takes it upstairs, yes. If it sits on someone's desk, because there's too much else going on, slower. He thought about it. The message I sent names Holt specifically and mentions a witness with documentary evidence. That should move it. Should, she said. Should, he agreed. She looked at the fire. If it moves slowly, she said, Thomas will have time to get ahead of it. He has contacts. He has resources I don't know the full extent of. He also has a problem, said Eli. He left his wife in open country without adequate water. That's not an action a man does without a reason, and the reason isn't something he can easily explain in terms that don't unravel the rest of it. She thought about this. He'll say I left voluntarily, she said. We had a disagreement. I chose to walk. He tried to stop me. That's what he'll say, said Eli. And then you'll say what actually happened. And then the other evidence comes in, and then it gets complicated for him in ways that get harder to manage. She nodded slowly. The notes, she said. I need the notes. You'll have them, he said. You don't know that, she said. No, he said, but you copy them. So even if the originals are gone, you have a copy. He paused. And you have yourself, your account, your memory of the letter, your observations over 2 years. Those are harder to destroy than paper. She looked at him across the fire. You're a practical man, she said. I try to be, he said. The fire made small sounds. The horses shifted their weight in the dark beyond the firelight, the soft sound of animals settling for the night. Above the plain, the stars were doing their extravagant thing, uncontested by any other light. The Milky Way visible as the actual river of light it is rather than the faint suggestion of it you get near towns. Can I ask you something? Said Eli. You've been doing it all day, she said. Fair, he said. The notes. Did you start keeping them because you suspected something specific or because you had a general sense that something was wrong? She thought about how to answer this. There was a moment, she said. About 14 months ago, Thomas came home from a run south, and he had a different horse. Not his horse. A different horse, better quality than anything his salary would explain. He gave me an explanation for it that was plausible enough on its surface. But when he turned in that night, and I couldn't sleep, I sat in the kitchen and I thought about all the plausible enough explanations from the previous 6 months. The horse was the first one I couldn't entirely let go of. She paused, so I started writing them down. Just a list, just what I had noticed, and what the explanation offered had been, and whether the explanation fully accounted for the thing. After 3 months of lists, the pattern was clear. The fire shifted. A log settled. And you didn't leave, said Eli. It was not a judgment. The tone of a man asking a question he genuinely doesn't know the answer to. Where would I have gone? She said. With what resources? To say what to whom? With what proof? She looked at the fire. I stayed because staying was the only thing that would eventually give me enough to leave with. She paused, and because I wasn't ready. People make that mistake about women in situations like mine. They think staying is a failure of understanding. I understood. I stayed anyway because I was calculating, and the calculation required time. Eli Cross was quiet for a moment. That's a hard thing to live through, he said. It was, she said. Exactly that. Not dramatized. Not minimized. It was, and now this is. She lay down on her side of the fire with her pack as a pillow and pulled her coat over herself and listened to the plains settle into the sounds of night. An owl somewhere distant, the horses, the low breath of the wind across the grass. She did not sleep immediately. She looked at the stars and thought about Caldwell, which was still a day's ride north, and the house, and the wardrobe with the hat box, and the loose board under the kitchen window. She thought about Harold Voss, and whether her letter had found a writer yet. She thought about the federal contact in Wichita, whether Eli's telegraph message had landed on the right desk or the wrong one. She thought about Thomas somewhere in that house, reading his paper on Sunday morning by habit, not knowing she was still alive, and riding north. She fell asleep with that thought because it was the most useful one available. They rode through the second day with purpose rather than urgency, which is a different thing. Urgency frays at the edges. Purpose holds. Clara rode with the quality of attention she had been cultivating for 14 months. Not anxious, not hypervigilant, but present, noting things. The road north was more traveled than the country south had been. They passed 2 wagons, and a rider going the other direction in the morning, and a small group of homesteaders with a heavily loaded cart in the afternoon. Normal country, normal traffic. Caldwell appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon as a collection of low shapes that gradually became distinguishable from the landscape as they approached. The water tower first, then the rooftops, then the specific geometry of the main street as the road straightened and widened into it. She felt nothing dramatic about seeing it, or rather she felt the particular complex thing that is not quite any single emotion. The combination of familiarity and changed relationship, of a place being the same and a person's position in it being entirely different. The house was still there. The garden was still there. The wardrobe and the hat box and the notes were presumably still there. She was not the same woman who had left it 3 days ago, sitting on a wagon seat while Thomas held the reins. She was, in some ways that mattered, more herself. She had walked 12 miles and found water and sent a letter and ridden north, and had conversations that changed what she knew and what she was able to do about it. The woman who had stayed for 14 months, making careful lists, was the same woman who had done all of those things. But the doing of them had made the list mean something new. They came into town on the West Road. Eli Cross rode beside her and said nothing, which was appropriate. He had taken her where she needed to go. The rest of this was hers. She did not go home first. She went to Harold Voss's office on the 2nd Street, which had a lamp burning in the window that meant he was still there. She dismounted at the post and went up the 2 steps to the door and knocked. He opened it himself. He was a thin man in his 50s with a precisely trimmed mustache and reading glasses that he had apparently just removed because he was holding them. He looked at her. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "Did you get my letter?" she said. "An hour ago," he said. He looked at her with the measured look of a man who is absorbing additional information from her physical presence. The road dust, the particular quality of her expression, the directness with which she was looking at him. "Come in." She went in. She sat across from his desk. He sat behind it. He did not ask if she wanted water or a cup of something, which she appreciated because she had water, and what she needed was the conversation. "I need to get to my house," she said, "and remove certain documents before my husband is aware I'm in Caldwell. Once I have them, I want to discuss the formal process for presenting evidence in the context of a federal investigation." She looked at him. "I understand there may already be an investigation underway into operations in the Territory Marshal Service. I have reason to believe my situation is directly connected to it." Harold Voss put his reading glasses on the desk. "How did you arrive at that understanding?" he said. "A man named Eli Cross," she said, "who was waiting outside." Voss was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. He looked at her. "Cross's brother," he said, "is a man I've been in correspondence with for the past 5 weeks. I suspected something like that," she said. "Mrs. Holt," he said, with the tone of a man choosing his words the way a person picks their way across a floor they are not certain will hold them. "You understand that what you are describing testimony regarding a sitting United States Marshal is not without risk. Your husband is still your husband under the law. He still holds his badge. He will have resources, and you will use them. I know, she said. You're prepared for what that means. She looked at Harold Voss across the desk. She thought about the list she had been making for 14 months. She thought about the second canteen, the copied notes, the tin of money she still had in her boot. She thought about the 12 miles she had walked on the day her husband had driven away and left her standing in the plains with the sun pressing down on her like a judgment. I've been preparing for over a year, she said. Voss looked at her for a moment longer. Then, let's start with the documents, he said. He stood. He took his hat from the hook beside the door. He looked at her. I'll come with you. She stood. Outside, Eli Cross was still at the post, his horse patient and rested, the man himself sitting easy in the saddle in the long light of the afternoon with the air of someone who is exactly where he expected to be and is fine with that. He looked at her when she came out. He's coming, she said, gesturing at Voss behind her. Ili nodded. Holt's horse is at the livery, he said. I checked when we came in. She absorbed this. He's home, she said. He's home, said Eli. She looked at the street. The familiar dust, the familiar late afternoon smell of the town she had lived in for 2 years. The house was 3 blocks east. The wardrobe was in the house. The notes were in the wardrobe. Her husband was presumably in the house with the notes, not yet knowing that the liability he had left in the southern plains had walked 12 miles to water, and then ridden 2 days north with a practical man who knew federal investigators. She had, by her estimate, a narrow window. She walked east.